You're about to listen to a brand new series of History's Heroes. New episodes will be released weekly wherever you get your podcasts. But if you're in the UK, you can listen to the latest episodes a week early, first on BBC Sounds.
He insisted on the loyalty of others, and those who were not loyal to him were punished.
His name was General Rafael Trujillo, and he was from the Dominican Republic in the heart of the Caribbean Sea. The country looked like paradise. Palm trees, sandy beaches, sparkling turquoise waters. But he made it hell. In 1930, he was elected president.
Well, he was elected in air quotes.
General Trujillo seized power in a coup. Afterwards, he stood for election, but had his soldiers guard the poll booths and allowed no other candidate to stand against him. Soon after this, another disaster hit the Dominican capital, Santo Domingo. A hurricane devastated the city. Of its 10,000 buildings, only 400 were left standing. Thousands were dead. In the ruins, Trujillo saw opportunity.
He set out to reconstruct the capital, but in a new modern way, and project himself as the restorer, the modernizer, the father of this new nation.
With the macho swagger that was his signature, Trujillo gave the capital a new name.
It's the oldest Spanish settlement continuously occupied in the Americas, and they changed its name to Ciudad Trujillo.
Trujillo City. He built roads, schools, hospitals.
So by modernizing, he was able to pay off national debt and made a big point that after years of being first colonized, occupied by Haiti, occupied by the United States, finally the Dominican Republic was independent of that.
But this development came at a cost.
He maintained his authority by establishing a political economy of favors where he obliged people to be loyal to him. It was a very transactional kind of relationship that he had with the Dominican Republic.
And those transactions made him rich beyond belief.
His family ended up controlling something like 75% of industry in the Dominican Republic.
Trujillo had complete control. Every one of his new public buildings bore an inscription glorifying him. Even in private houses, many people displayed his pictures and plaques.
There are a number of versions of this, but one version said, "In this home, God and Trujillo rule."
But in the town of Salcedo, a young woman named Minerva Mirabal and her sisters refused to bow down to the dictator. They vowed to end the era of Trujillo or die in the attempt. For BBC Radio 4, this is History's Heroes. People with purpose, brave ideas, and the courage to stand alone. I'm Alex von Tunzelmann, I'm a historian, and today's episode is about Minerva Mirabal and her sisters. At the height of a vicious and terrifying regime, they risked everything to liberate their nation. Minerva Mirabal was born in 1926. There was always something different about her.
She was a natural-born leader. She was very independent, very determined.
Heather Hennes is a professor of Spanish at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. She's one of the translators of Alive in Their Garden, the memoir of Dede Mirabal, Minerva's sister.
She was very steadfast in her views and very unapologetic of them.
At a very young age, she began to hate Rafael Trujillo. It began when a classmate told her a terrible secret.
That little girl's father had been murdered by the regime, and the little girl had seen her father vomit blood and die. That was the pivotal moment in Minerva's coming into awareness about the regime and what it really meant.
But Minerva's family history and the history of her country had already set her on a course as a rebel. In 1492, Christopher Columbus claimed the Caribbean island of Hispaniola for Spain. The native people were conquered and enslaved. By the 20th century, the island was divided into two nations, Haiti and the Dominican Republic.
The Dominican Republic was very much based on subsistence farming. You had a very small elite who became wealthy, and the majority were poor.
At the time, the United States often intervened politically and militarily in Central American and Caribbean countries. United States Marines were repeatedly sent to the Dominican Republic and formally occupied it in 1916, setting up direct rule from Washington, D.C.
It's seen on the one hand as something that modernized the country, but on the other hand, it came at the expense of national sovereignty.
The Americans developed the Dominican Republic at the barrel of a gun.
People were under surveillance. There were a number of people who were taken from their homes, who were killed because they were suspected of being subversives.
One of the families under suspicion was that of Minerva's mother. She was just 18 herself when American soldiers burned her family home to the ground. Minerva's grandmother lost her sanity after witnessing American atrocities.
That resentment, that anti-Americanism stayed with the family.
Minerva had 3 sisters, Patria, Dede, and Maria Teresa.
Patria was a very warm, caring, religious person. She was known for her kindness. Dede was actually very outgoing. She was sociable. She was popular, but she was also very responsible, very prudent. Maria Teresa was the youngest. She was the baby of the family. She just had a certain innocence to her. She always wanted to see the good in people.
That kind of trust in others was increasingly rare as Trujillo tightened his grip on the nation. During the American occupation, he'd been trained by the Marines in techniques including torture. Now he put that education to work. He spun an elaborate web of spies to catch any dissent. Soon his network had a name, the Servicio de Inteligencia Militar, or SIM.
They were a kind of not-so-secret police who would drive around the cities in Volkswagen Beetles that became known as cepillos. Cepillo means brush, kind of like they were sweeping through the streets, cleaning it of opposition. And these agents became a very feared aspect of Dominican life.
The intense fear Trujillo created among Dominican people was infectious. Neighbours informed on each other. If someone caught wind that you spoke against Trujillo, your name might appear in the state-controlled newspaper El Caribe.
There was even a column in El Caribe called El Foro Público, the public forum, where people would denounce other Dominicans who were dissidents, who did something suspicious or did something that was against the regime.
You couldn't trust anyone.
A number of Dominicans who lived during this time have told me that they remember in their homes that their parents would say, be very careful about what you say and to whom. Even the walls have ears. Don't say anything to anyone. The spies were everywhere. The snitches were everywhere.
Those who didn't fit Trujillo's vision of the nation were eliminated. In 1937, when Minerva and her sisters were still just children, Trujillo ordered a campaign of ethnic cleansing along the border with Haiti. The Dominican people were a complex mix of European, African, and indigenous heritage. Trujillo himself had African ancestry through his Haitian grandmother, though he concealed this fact. He ordered his soldiers to kill Haitians, largely identified as black people.
Trujillo initiated a campaign to clean out, so to speak, this region, to assert the European heritage of the Dominican Republic over its African roots.
Estimates of the number of suspected Haitians killed vary widely because the evidence was so successfully covered up. Historians generally suggest that between 9,000 and 35,000 people were massacred. For the Mirabal sisters, the slaughter struck close to home.
A friendly Haitian man that they knew used to buy his goods from their father. This man's name was Baudot, and they remembered that one day they came and just took him away, and they never saw him again.
On the 13th of October, 1949, Minerva Mirabal had an opportunity to express the anger smouldering within her. Her father, Enrique, had been invited to bring his daughters to a lavish ball. It wasn't the sort of invitation he could decline. The ball was in honor of Trujillo, and the dictator would be there in person.
He knew that if he refused, then that would be a clear sign that he was rejecting Trujillo.
Not attending could cost him everything, but attending could cost his daughters dearly as well.
Trujillo was known to have his assistants arrange sexual encounters between him and the daughters of people who he suspected of being opposed to him, even teenage girls.
Minerva had caught the eye of the dictator. At 23 years old, she was strikingly beautiful. But Trujillo wasn't only interested in her looks. Even at such a young age, she'd acquired a reputation for defiance.
There's an anecdote where she was riding through the town and somebody was putting up a pro-Trujillo sign on their place of business. And she said, "Why are you putting that up? Why are you giving into this?"
When the Mirabal family arrived at the ball, it was clear that Minerva had been singled out. One of Trujillo's assistants asked her to dance. No sooner had she stepped onto the ballroom floor than she was passed into the arms of the dictator.
He was not a tall man. To compensate that, he wanted to have a very strong physical presence. He wore military uniforms, a bicorn hat. He also was known to, at times, wear makeup that would whiten his skin.
The orchestra played merengue, the traditional music of the Dominican Republic. Trujillo danced across the floor with Minerva. For her sisters watching, the songs lasted an eternity.
Trujillo asked her if she was interested in his politics, and she said that she didn't like them. And he said, "Well, what if I set my supporters to convince you?"
Everything depended on her answer, her fate and her family's. Minerva looked the dictator in the eye and said, "And what if I convince them?"
Her father was arrested, and she was arrested as well. She was encouraged to write a letter of apology to Trujillo, and she refused to do that. She was encouraged to meet with him, to plead for forgiveness, refused to do that.
It was part of Trujillo's public image as a supposedly benevolent leader to pose as a defender of the family, women and children. This was hypocrisy. He was known as the GOAT for his relentless sexual encounters. He liked to pretend these were seductions, but there were rape allegations against him dating back to his youth. Women and girls who refused to sleep with him risked terrible consequences for themselves and their families. Publicly, though, the lie had to be maintained.
He was protecting Dominican families, and he was protecting Dominican women and children. And so for him and his regime to imprison women completely undermined his public image as the father figure of this nation.
To protect his image, Trujillo soon released Minerva from house arrest, but he would find other ways to exact his revenge. In the years after the ball, the Mirabal sisters married. There was one principle they wouldn't compromise.
Leandro Guzman, who was Maria Teresa's husband, tells the story about when they were dating, he made it clear that he would like to be boyfriend and girlfriend. Maria Teresa said, "Wait a minute, I need to know what your view is of Trujillo."
He said that in his house, they didn't display a plaque to the dictator either. Maria Teresa married him shortly after. Minerva was courted by a lawyer named Manolo Tavares, a fierce opponent of the regime. He drove all the way to the Mirabal's house with a piano in the bed of a truck, just so he could serenade her. The piano arrived out of tune, but she married him anyway.
The relationship that she had with Manolo Tavares was very intellectual. Both loved literature and music.
In the early 1950s, Minerva went to law school herself. She persisted even when the Public Forum newspaper column declared her a communist. Minerva was interested in left-wing ideas. She listened to radio broadcasts by Dominicans living in exile.
There are stories about Minerva and Manolo going out in a boat, supposedly to go fishing, but while they're out there in the boat, they're tuning into these radio broadcasts from abroad, and they're being inspired.
But this was the height of the Cold War, and the United States was preoccupied with the threat of communism. Trujillo capitalized on this to shore up the support he enjoyed from Washington. He took out adverts in the American press, presenting himself as the foremost anti-communist in the Western Hemisphere. For Minerva to be labelled a communist jeopardized not only herself, but those around her.
She had to get some books bound for her classes, and the clerk who bound the books for her was called out in the public forum for having used university materials to provide this service for Minerva, who was a communist. The clerk who bound her books was later fired.
But nothing broke her spirit. One day she was studying for a final exam with a friend and her sister Maria Teresa. The phone rang. Minerva answered.
She said, okay, and hung up.
Her friend asked who it was.
And she said, it was a Calle. They said they're going to kill me tomorrow. Don't tell Maria Teresa. She didn't want to upset her. So she sat down and she started studying again.
In 1957, Minerva graduated with outstanding grades, but the regime denied her a license to practice law. All those years of work, and she couldn't begin her career.
That was one of the hardest blows that the regime delivered to her personally.
Minerva wrote in her diary, "Sometimes I just want to disappear so I don't have to deal with so much injustice." The Mirabal sisters found themselves isolated.
Anyone who was associated with the family, who helped the family, ran the risk of being punished.
They knew there must be others like them, scattered across the country. The problem was that Trujillo had so terrorized the population, it was impossible to coordinate any resistance. But at the very beginning of 1959, something happened that emboldened the sisters. On the nearby island of Cuba, Fidel Castro's revolution overthrew Trujillo's ally, the vicious dictator Fulgencio Batista.
And Minerva is quoted by a number of people as having asked, why, if the Cubans can do it, why can't we do it too?
Castro had the same idea. He dropped coins into a collection box handed to him by Dominican refugees and said, "Trujillo next."
Castro's government helps train some Dominicans in exile and other fighters from other countries to go back into the Dominican Republic and topple the dictatorship.
On the 14th of June 1959, a plane flew from Cuba to the Dominican Republic. It was followed by 2 yachts. A total of around 225 guerrillas were headed for Trujillo. But Trujillo's intelligence officers knew they were coming. The dictator had his men in position, and the guerrillas were slaughtered.
Most of them were killed right then and there. Others were taken for questioning and torturing, and then later killed.
Minerva and her sisters listened in horror to the state-controlled radio broadcast, which announced that all guerrillas who'd been captured were executed. But the sisters didn't back down.
They felt inspired to pick up the baton, so to speak, and carry on this mission, but in a slightly different way.
They decided to found a movement to unite resistance groups across the country.
They realized that they needed to connect with these other movements and build a network that was bigger and stronger than any that had existed before.
And they made sure that the movement was protected against Trujillo's spies.
They decided to build a network based on cells of 3, with the idea that if somebody is captured, there's less likelihood that a lot of people will be exposed.
In honour of the failed invasion, the group called itself the 14th of June Movement. Its mission was to remove Rafael Trujillo and hold free and fair elections. Over the next year, Minerva, her sisters, and their husbands secretly recruited young people and plotted acts of sabotage.
They burned sugarcane fields or set the Social Security building on fire, threw nails into the highway to cause disruptions to call attention.
And in the meantime, the sisters prepared for a day of reckoning.
Nores, who is Patria's daughter, tells stories about when they would sit at the kitchen table. They would make small explosives that might be used for some kind of a demonstration.
If they had to face Trujillo's well-armed forces, though, it wasn't clear they could fight.
They didn't have a lot of weapons. They didn't have guns to defend themselves. And so people were concerned that they just didn't have what they needed if they were confronted.
Soon, members of the movement were arrested. Manolo was first, then Leandro. Then Maria Teresa was picked up, and finally Minerva. In just a few weeks, hundreds of people were imprisoned. Trujillo's agents went after the Mirabals.
They confiscated Patria's house, ransacked it, took the livestock, auctioned off the furniture.
Trujillo had been waiting for an excuse to punish Minerva Mirabal.
She was an evasive opponent who was a real threat to how he saw himself, and that tormented him.
Minerva and Maria Teresa were taken to a torture facility known as La Cuarenta, or the 40. Prisoners were strapped into electric chairs or put in a rubber collar that could be tightened enough to sever a man's head. But for the Mirabals, Trujillo had a different punishment in mind.
They would bring the women in to witness the torture of their husbands. The men were subjected to horrific physical torture, including electric probes, the electric chair, cigarette burns.
Even through this, Minerva kept her composure.
When Minerva was brought in to watch the torture, the guards started to make innuendos that she should be nice to them because maybe one day she would want to marry one of them. And she flat out rejected them and said, "We don't like military men and much less murderers like you."
The prisoners couldn't know it at the time, but they were winning influential allies. For years, the Catholic Church had looked the other way from the regime's atrocities. But in the wake of these arrests, priests all across the Dominican Republic read a letter to their congregations.
That letter says that people have inherent rights and the government needs to respect those rights. It was a call to Trujillo to suspend the torture, the arrests, the abuse of human rights.
The letter was a turning point for the regime.
Trujillo would make a comment that his two biggest problems were the Mirabal family and the Catholic Church.
The dictator longed to be rid of Minerva.
You can't have her in prison because that looks bad internationally. And you can't have her out of prison because she still refuses to desist. So what do?
Minerva had endured death threats for most of her adult life. But months later, when she and Maria Teresa were released from prison, they felt the damage.
She lost weight, she got sick, she had chronic throat problems.
She still believed that Trujillo would stop short of murdering her.
Which is too much bad press for him to kill a woman like that everybody knew was a dissident.
For now, the sisters were free, but their husbands were still in prison. On the 25th of November 1960, Minerva, Patria and Maria Teresa planned to visit them. A friend named Rufino de la Cruz offered to drive there in his Jeep.
Knowing that they were being threatened and that he still offered to drive them was an act of heroism in and of itself.
But not everyone wanted them to go.
The mother, Doña Chea, had premonitions, and she would say, "Oh, they're going to throw you from the cliff." She had a strong sense that her children were, or at least Minerva, was going to be killed.
The Jeep drove to the prison in the north of the island. The Mirabals were permitted to see their husbands, but an hour before the end of visiting time, the guard cut the meeting short. It was 4 o'clock when the sisters and their driver set out for home.
They were intercepted by the SIM on the highway. They were taken from the vehicle and put into the vehicles of the SIM.
The agents drove them to a field and separated them.
Different SIM agents took the different sisters and Rufino de la Cruz, strangled them, beat them to death, put them back in the car, and brought the car to a precipice, thinking that it would look like an accident.
When the Jeep teetered on the edge of a cliff, an assassin saw that one of the sisters was still moving.
Minerva was actually alive still, was making some noises. And so one of the agents gave her a final blow, and she died, and they pushed this Jeep over the precipice.
As night fell, and the sisters didn't arrive home, their mother worried that her premonition had come true.
And the next day, somebody came to the door with a note saying that the sisters had been killed in an accident.
Trujillo hoped that eliminating the sisters would end the resistance to his regime. In fact, he'd kicked a hornet's nest. Demonstrators took to the streets. People slipped notes under each other's doors to signal solidarity. The notes were called A Kiss for the Mirabal Sisters. Minerva and her sisters had always wanted to unite the resistance. Their deaths had accomplished that.
He promised protection for Dominican families. He promised to protect the well-being of the Dominican people, but on the contrary, he was murdering mothers of young children. He was destroying families.
The sisters' courage was a call to action.
The group of men who are now called Los Héroes del 30 de Mayo, the heroes of the 30th of May, some of them did say that when they heard the news of the Mirabal sisters' death, they said to themselves, that's it. Where are the men in this country? We have to do something. This has gone too far.
Trujillo hadn't rid himself of Minerva after all.
There were accounts that he felt tormented by thoughts of Minerva, felt that he was seeing her. He would be with his driver and he would say that he saw Minerva on the street.
On the 30th of May, 1961, Trujillo's driver was taking the dictator to a tryst of the sort Minerva once denied him with his 20-year-old mistress. But the car was attacked by armed men.
They stopped his car on the highway and shot him to death. And he died there on the highway.
The dictator was dead. His 31-year reign of terror was over. Peace didn't follow. Trujillo's son Ramfis took over and tortured most of his father's murderers to death. But Ramfis didn't have his father's political instincts and couldn't hold power for long. Soon he fled into exile, and the Dominican Republic finally held its first free elections. Unfortunately, the optimism of that first free government didn't last long. The democratic president was soon ousted in a coup, and the country fell into civil war. In 1965, responding to unfounded rumours of a communist takeover, the United States invaded again. The Americans left behind another authoritarian regime. Today, the Dominican Republic still struggles with the aftermath of colonialism, dictatorship, and foreign occupation. But the Mirabal sisters endure as figures of inspiration to anyone who resists tyranny and fights for a better future.
The Mirabal sisters draw our attention to a generation of Dominicans that had to risk everything. This is why the story is important, so that today's young people know what this country went through and don't repeat that history.